So I've been following today's interviewee on social media for a few months now. His name's Josh Connolly, and particularly on LinkedIn, he shares a lot of content. And what inspires me the most about his content is his level of vulnerability. So much of what he shares is stuff he's learned as going through some of the biggest trials within his life, through addiction, through disassociation, through childhood trauma. And it's impacted him a lot through many, many years, and he's come out the other side of that as a truly, truly inspirational man and human being. I find him very, very inspirational to watch, and I find a lot of the stuff that he puts out there and the values that he espouses to be very, very inspirational. He's actually almost become a little bit of a mentor for me in terms of how he operates on social media and that level of vulnerability. So I really, really hope that by sharing his story, you might be able to discover a few things about owning your own story and how that can align into finding mentorship and coaching and help find that guide that you might need through different parts of your journey. So let's take a look and see what he's got to say. So Josh Connolly, welcome, sir. Delighted to have you here. How are you?
Good, thank you. Yeah, happy to be here. Looking forward to the conversation actually, and sort of chatting about some things that perhaps I wouldn't normally get the opportunity to do so. So yeah, looking forward to it.
Yeah, I always appreciate the kind of attitude that you've come in with, because I've found a lot of benefit, like, in my own life, particularly over the past 2 or 3 years, of just being curious about everything. And whereas I used to want to do everything so scripted, and I used to have to kind of like need a teleprompter to do any video recordings and all that kind of stuff. But as soon as I've got kind of curious about stuff, I feel things feel a lot more natural and available to me. Do you kind of experience any of that?
Yeah, and I think, you remove a lot of the risk and the vulnerability in the stuff that you do if you live a life where you say, I'm going to be curious and I'm going to, almost actively seek to allow myself to be wrong. Because then, I have conversations with people, and, I do things and people say, you said this, and what do you think about this? And I go, well, yeah, maybe what I said the first time was wrong then, actually, based on what you've just said there. I think I changed my mind. And I think there's a real freedom in that. And it helps you to kind of grow from your experiences in a way that the old sort of fixed mentality that I also used to follow prevented me from doing.
Yeah. I completely agree with that. It's one of the most powerful things that I've also embraced, and I love the fact that you've done that as well, because coupling curiosity, and we're going off on a tangent here, but that's totally fine because I think it's fun. Coupling curiosity with the courage to be able to say, I was wrong, I'm sorry.
Yeah,
that is hugely freeing.
Yeah. And actually, in the end, it certainly does in the beginning. It takes some courage, right? Because it's a whole change of like narrative in the way that you look at things. But actually, I don't know if you found this, but once you really embrace the idea of being wrong, it doesn't even require courage, because it's so freeing. And so, like, the moment you find out that you're wrong about something, the moment you find out that you're wrong about something, you've just found a new idea, something new to explore. And I love that. I get excited when I read a book and I go, and it makes me wrong. If I pick up a book and I start reading it and I think, this is just talking about that stuff that I already know, there's no excitement in that for me, So when I start reading a book and it makes me wrong, and I agree with the fact that I'm wrong when I'm reading it, that's exciting for me.
Yeah, I very much appreciate that. I very much
Mm,
appreciate that. And it also kind of takes you out of the idea that you will end up in a echo chamber, right? Just
yeah,
feeding yourself the same rhetoric over and over again, which just solidifies staunch belief system without the ability to kind of explore other avenues. I did that
yeah,
for 32, 33 years of my life,
yeah.
believing I had all the answers.
Yeah, and I did the same. And actually, I think a lot of it's born out of a fear of that kind of vulnerability that comes certainly in the initial stages of allowing yourself to be wrong. That vulnerability of putting things out there and being able to be prove you wrong. You know,
Yeah.
which which the reality is in any kind of debate, I should literally the way that we should debate, or the way that I should debate, is to seek to make myself wrong. I mean, that's should be my ultimate goal in any debate with somebody, is to make myself wrong, because if I do that, then I'm going to get somewhere near the truth. I'm either going to leave being like, I have thrown everything at my kind of hypothesis here and I've come away thinking, you know what, it must be right. Or I'm going to come away with a new idea and realize that I had something in my life that wasn't serving me because it wasn't right.
Mm. And that's the important thing, right? Because you've identified something in your life that isn't serving you.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. And that's when growth comes. The one thing I think that I've learned about growth as a person is it's not about gaining necessarily more knowledge, it's about shedding past knowledge. Does that make sense? It does make sense. Yeah.
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
not it's not necessarily about the gaining of more knowledge, it's about the shedding of past knowledge that no longer serves you.
yeah. Because past knowledge can often just be bias.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly. Yeah.
yeah. And so that was a nice little kind of intro segue. I like that. But we are going to be talking about mentors and mentorship, because ultimately this is Heroes Month, which is all about role models, mentorship, influence, heroes, the hero's journey, and things like that. And as I was kind of doing my research, so you wear your heart on your sleeve, so to speak, and you're kind of very vulnerable about what you talk about across your various different platforms and channels. Um, and on your, I guess your pillar video on your website, you say that you struggled with trauma as a young boy. And I want to kind of do like a disclaimer thing here to say that if I ask any questions of you that because trauma is a dangerous topic to go down a lot of times. If I ask a question of you, at which point you're not kind of you don't feel like it's a good place to kind of explore that in any way, shape, or form for either you, for me, or the listeners, then please just let me know. This is editable.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
there's my disclaimer. Um,
And can I
so,
just quickly say as well, I appreciate you saying that. I think that's important actually when you're talking about this kind of stuff. Fortunately, I'm actually in a place where you won't ask me anything that will make me uncomfortable. But if it was to happen, I can make that decision now. I've reached a stage in my life where I can make the decision where I'd be able to say no. So
yeah.
I appreciate you actually setting that up like that.
Yeah, my pleasure. I've learned that the hard way as well, and had to apologize. Um, so you did say you struggle with trauma as a young boy, and I often think about what that means in terms of kind of role models that we have when we were young. So I was wondering if you wouldn't mind kind of sharing some of your experience of what that trauma was, for context, first of all.
Well, I grew up. My dad was an alcoholic, so I lost my dad when I was 9 years old. So up until he died, he spent some time in prison, and I think, look, the impacts that it had on me when I was a child have been far-reaching. I think often when we talk about trauma, we think that we're talking about traumatic events, and of course, traumatic events are traumatic, but that's not necessarily what I'm talking about when I say I experienced trauma. Um, Talking of mentors, somebody who I follow and will come on to later, I'm sure, Dr. Gabor Mate. for me, gives the best definition when we're talking about trauma. For a start, it comes from the Greek word meaning wound. So when we talk about trauma, we're talking about an internal wound. We're not talking about what happened to me. We're talking about what happened inside of me as a result of what happened to me. An internal wound, so to speak. So the environment that I existed in particularly the initial 9 years of my life were frightening. It was one where my parents, including my mum, were unable to be emotionally available for me. So I was unable to be emotionally available for myself, and so I almost had to abandon my body, so to speak. I had to find ways to disconnect from how I felt, because how I felt was too painful to bear, and I didn't have anybody to support me in feeling it. So, the trauma that I experienced was as a result of what happened to me, but the trauma was that disconnect, that growing up with an inability to see any of my own value, to an inability to kind of understand my own feelings, understand them, know what they were, communicate them. All of that stuff fell down. But it was a hugely chaotic environment, and one where ultimately it was very, very lonely. If I was going to tap in and to how I truly felt, there was nowhere for me to turn. Particularly because my dad's problem was one of addiction. Still true today, but more so back then. It was so stigmatized that you couldn't talk about it. It wasn't like if my dad had, I don't know, some other kind of illness that he eventually died from when he was 9 years old that wasn't stigmatized, I maybe would have found places to be able to talk about it and say, my dad suffers with this, and I would have found love and compassion. But when it's something like addiction, it's, swept under the carpet and nobody talks about it. So that's kind of like a summary of, I guess, what I experienced.
Yeah, particularly as a 9-year-old. Where do you go as a child when your primary caregivers are unavailable like that? Did you have any kind of other role models in your life that at least acted in some way, shape, or form as an outlet during those formative years?
No. I mean, I think it's really important to say that. I mean, like, I had teachers,
Sure.
but the teachers didn't know anything. And I had already sort of set about the world trying to impress people and trying to find some kind of validation. So I never told anybody what was going on at home. So any connections and bonds that I did make weren't based on who I was anyway. So I felt no sense of connection in them. So, I mean, ultimately, until things changed for me as an adult, I never really connected with anybody on any level. I was terribly alone for most of my life. And I know that might sound kind of dramatic and awful, but that is the reality of it.
Yeah. Yeah, and so many kind of men that I speak to and have that haven't had necessarily the extent of trauma throughout their childhood that you've had, they kind of go through their life and their relationships and their loneliness develops over time, because in their younger life they've got connection, they've got intimacy in various degrees, in various different forms with various different people, and then just things kind of change over time with relationships and lack of activity, and we get kind of stuck into a career and stuff like that, and our ability to connect with others starts to diminish. But it sounds like you didn't even have that foundation, so it was loneliness from day one.
Yeah, look, when you talk about men, I think it's common in men to struggle to be able to tap into what our emotions are, and certainly to be able to communicate them, and then to be with somebody in their emotions. So if men finding that difficult, there's no men passing it on to other men. So of all the traumatic things that I experienced when I was younger, probably the most one of the longest lasting, deepest kind of impact one was not having a loving relationship with a man when I was a child. I never knew how to be around men apart from sort of like laddie, I kind of learned how to be laddie when I was a teenager. But that lack of kind of emotional literacy and the ability to be able to communicate it was a huge problem. And like you say, with no foundations when I was younger, the lasting impacts of that were obviously huge.
Yeah. And you say you found a way to be laddie. in your teenage years. And I know through hearing your story, I think it was you were 25 when you chose to face your addiction, if I'm not mistaken.
I stopped drinking at 24.
You stopped drinking at 24.
But probably faced my addiction when I was 25.
Yeah, fair.
Yeah, yeah.
Interesting. So we'll come back to that in a second, but like, just want to kind of piece together those years, the kind of, so you'd found a way to be laddie, and eventually that would come round to you facing your own addiction. Was there something in the fact that you finally found connection with people through this kind of laddie behavior that would ultimately start off the drinking? I'm kind of placing a bit of my own bias in here, but
yes, to a degree, yes, because people will say that I fell into the wrong crowd. Yeah, we talk about falling into the wrong crowd.
Sure.
I didn't fall. I went there. I went to the crowd that looked like they had something that might work, although that was a subconscious thing. That's what happened. The people around me when I was 12, 13 years old that were drinking and smoking drugs, right? None of them were living a life where at home everything was hunky-dory. I mean, they weren't all abandoned physically by their dad, but a lot of them probably at least had emotionally unavailable parents or a dad. So we all had that commonality, so we bonded on our trauma, although none of us knew that and none of us talked about that. We made the connection on surface level in a kind of let's get drunk and smoke drugs together kind of basis. But behind all of that were the same kind of patterns, the same seeking to belong, the seeking to want to be part of, the seeking for connection with other, boys/men. Because I never had it. I never knew how to do it. I didn't know that I could be in a relationship with a man and a man care for me and me care for them, as friends. I just didn't. I'd never experienced it.
Yeah. And then ultimately, you decided to stop drinking at 24 and face your addiction at 25. So what was that kind of moment like? Like, what was your awakening moment is, I guess, the question I'm trying to ask.
So the actual moment, I mean, there was like a series of events. So I'd been like, as a young adult, as in my late teens, early 20s, I was quite involved in like football violence. I'd gone from gangs as a teenager to be involved in football violence, and I'd realized how much bravado that was. I'd found connection there, false connection. I'd found a sense of purpose and meaning in my life in gangs, and then I'd found it in a similar way in the football violence. And the football violence had sort of, I'd been let down by people that I thought cared for me, but didn't. And when I say let down, I mean let down in a silly way. So I sort of was reaching this place where my world was sort of, as I knew it, was falling down around me. But it was, the day that I woke up and stopped drinking was the 14th of May 2012. But on the 13th of May 2012, I don't know if you're much of a football fan, but Aguero, your Leeds, are you? Okay.
Which is kind of wild at the moment, so we won't go into that. But yeah,
yeah, we won't go into Leeds. I've grown up being taught to hate Leeds.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I don't know why. I'm a Swindon fan, but as a young adult, everybody hated Leeds.
Yes, that's very true. Yeah,
and I think probably in my prime of going to football, Leeds were in the same league as us. But anyway, on the 13th of May 2012 was the day that Aguero scored that goal in the last second to make Man City to take the league off of Man United. And I was sat in the pub at the time, and it had been hot. I'd had an awful weekend. I was supposed to have my children, and I had let them down because I felt like I couldn't do it. And I remember everybody going crazy in the pub because Aguero scored that goal. You remember? It goes, Aguero!
Oh, yeah.
And just there was beer going everywhere. And I looked around and I just thought, I had this moment of clarity, this realization. I was like, I'm not, I'm not connected to any of you. I don't know anyone in here. This is not working anymore. And I'd struck up a friendship with, believe it or not, the landlord of the pub, who was an ex-compulsive gambler at the time. Actually, and this is, a good part of the conversation. He'd sort of metaphorically taken me under his wing for a couple of months. He was sharing stories with me about how he
Oh,
used to
interesting.
gamble. Yeah, he would do it in a very charismatic way. He was an ex-footballer. He had he won his first house playing cards, lost the same house playing cards. But he talked about gambling and the feelings and the driving things behind his gambling in a way that was relatable, in a way that I'd never seen from another man before. And I had a conversation with him that night after Aguero scored that goal. And the next morning I woke up and quit alcohol and drugs and smoking, and have not touched any of it again since. For me, what happened is the next 9 months of my life were probably some of the most difficult months I've ever lived. I couldn't deal with the emotions that came flooding back. Everything, alcohol was never my problem. It was an attempt at the solution. And after 9 months, I realized now I couldn't blame anything on alcohol. I still didn't want to see my kids. I didn't know it, but they made me so overwhelmed. I couldn't deal with all the feelings, and it was triggering me about my childhood. And I had no idea of any of this. I just thought there was something wrong with me. So I made a decision to take my own life. And by then I was 25. And I went to see my kids for one last time. And because I knew I was going to die, the past became irrelevant. The future was non-existent. And for the first time ever in my life, I was present with my kids in a way that I'd never experienced before. I remember cuddling my daughter and feeling it. And it was in that kind of weekend I changed my mind. And probably more importantly, I realized that something was going on inside of me. And that's when I kind of started properly looking for help and support and trying to work on myself from then, after changing my mind. And then the next 9 years have been, my life has been completely different. And I've been on more of a road of more obvious healing, at least. Yeah.
Well, listen, I really, really appreciate you sharing your story, and it's funny as you kind of sharing that. Like, I want to ask so many more questions within the story, but I know that around like surrendering to the idea of asking for help. There's so much within that, and there's so many kind of different pieces within your story that we could hone in on. But I want to kind of focus on the mentors piece.
Of course. Yeah.
And I thought it was really, really interesting up until that point of how you kind of explored mentorship and male role models and connection with other men during that process. But I know that you then went into the 12-step program. You told me that you went into the 12-step program.
Mm-hmm.
And I've never been in it myself. One of my very, very good friends has gone through the 12-step program, and I've read Russell Brand's book. That's about as close as I've gotten to the 12-step program myself.
Yeah. Well, the book is it. The book is it. I mean, he's just written it in a way that's kind of accessible to anyone. So that, his book is it. The 12 steps in there are the 12 steps that I took, essentially.
Yeah. And at what point does a mentor come into that program for you as a recovering addict?
At the very beginning. So, once you're kind of ready to go through that process, you go through that process with somebody that's been through that path before and can kind of hold your hand through it. And in the beginning, I'll tell you that I was almost too dependent on my mentor in that sense. I had to speak to them every day. I barely made a decision without ringing them. I leaned on them just incredibly at the beginning. And, certainly for the first perhaps 2 years, maybe even a little bit longer than that, but certainly the first 2 years, I was almost codependent on them. But that allowed me to then, kind of flourish and move to the next phase of my sobriety or my healing, recovery, whatever you want to call it. But I certainly wouldn't have got through those 2 years without him holding my hand.
Yeah.
Metaphorically, yeah.
Yeah. And you said about, because you said there about like almost too much. Was that just kind of like a turn of phrase, or do you feel like maybe you did it slightly wrong, or maybe is that still just kind of a narrative where you feel like shouldn't necessarily be dependent on someone? Is that still?
If in normal day-to-day life, for the average human being, I wouldn't suggest it was healthy to become like that with somebody for a prolonged period of time. In the context of where I was in my life and the journey that I was on, those 2 years, I absolutely needed to be dependent in that way. So it's a really good question, because kind of highlights that I needed, I always say that the 12 steps became my life for 2 years
Yeah.
so that they could become part of my life. And essentially, really what I was doing is some of the work that I should have done when I was a child, which is depend solely on somebody so that you can find a level of independence, which would take you to a stage of interdependence. Yeah. Where you're kind of relying on each other in the way that I believe humans are supposed to do. So, yeah. So to your question, I think I perhaps used it in a turn of phrase, but in the context of where I was at in my life, it wasn't too much. It was exactly what was needed. However, as an adult, that level of dependence for me should be temporary, if possible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it sounds like because you had that 2 years of almost codependency, and then how did the relationship change as you found more independency from that reliance then?
Well, I think in a sense, I outgrew that mentor.
Okay.
I kind of outgrew it, started to evolve as a person, and I think it's an important thing to kind of say, that as I evolved as a person, as does my circle and everybody in it, right? So the guy that was meant, I don't even speak to him anymore. So I mean, that tells you how far away from him I've kind of moved. And by the way, not in a we don't talk anymore. Just I haven't spoke to him in probably 2 or 3 years. So I think you sort of you grow and evolve. I grew and evolved as a person. Started needing different things in my life, and I guess the relationship that we had, we never really became friends. It was more of a relationship where he helped me on my journey.
Okay. Yeah, because that was actually going to be a question that I ask later on in terms of kind of mentor relationships, but I'll save that for later. Did you then kind of explore different mentors within the 12-step program, or did mentors start to kind of evolve into other parts of life?
They certainly started to evolve into other parts of life. I think what's interesting, and that's kind of coming up, literally as we're talking about it, is until I began talking about it, and apart from when we get onto maybe who the guy who mentors me more now, that's always been that very clearly started off as a kind of mentorship relationship. Before that, I had always had somebody in my life who I kind of looked up to and wanted to impress, right? Which is essentially a father figure, isn't it? So I had it in the gang, and then I had it in the football stuff, and then I had it at the beginning of the 12-step kind of program that I did, and then I kind of moved through life in a bit of a solo manner for a while, I guess. I mean, arguably, I met my wife when I was about 2 years sober. So you'd have a good argument for my wife becoming my mentor for quite a while, in terms of showing me some kind of stability, teaching me how to lean on one another, how to be interdependent. And yeah, I think for a while, and still now to some degree, I'm certainly a product of what do they say? Behind every good man, there's an even better woman. I think that's certainly true. That's certainly true for me. Yeah. So I think then that I needed to learn about love, right? I mean, I guess I found out what connection was, and then I needed to learn what love was and what it was like to give myself to somebody and all the kind of fear and the risk and the vulnerability that comes with that. So I guess my wife then became my mentor.
Yeah,
for a while.
I can speak to a lot about that because even though kind of my childhood doesn't really have any kind of trauma involved in it, there wasn't a lot of affection.
Yeah.
It was like that knowing that you were loved, but there wasn't really the show of love. It was so much now that, you know, it's even a kind of a bit of a battle for me internally to tell my mum that I love her. It's kind of
right with you on it.
It's a distant idea. And now with my partner, she's very much my mentor, and she's teaching me effectively about intimacy, how to be intimate, how to kind of express intimacy, and how to be comfortable within intimate environments. And I'm not talking about just sex, I'm talking about emotional intimacy, which has been alien for me for so long.
Yeah, listen, when we first met, you know, you bring up sex, that was probably the only way that I kind of knew how to show my affection, right? And within my family, who are all incredible people, you know, my mum's incredible, my brothers are incredible, but you know, if I'm sat with my wife and I put my arm around her and, you know, do the kissing on the cheek and all that, you know, when we're with my family, they're all a bit like, oh, what is this? What are you doing? You know, because it's almost alien to them. But I kind of started to learn and realize that I do, you know, I need that stuff in my life. I want that intimacy and I want to be able to do it. So I, you know, everything you've just said there really sort of resonates deeply with the kind of journey I guess I've been on with my wife too. I remember when we first went out, by the way, and I didn't hold her hand. Like, you know, when we were, and she thought it was like, she thought I was embarrassed to be out with her. And I was like, no, I just didn't realize that we do affection outside of anywhere but the bedroom.
Yes, exactly.
I didn't.
Because it doesn't even, it's not, because there is the resistance to it, which I'm kind of working through now. But then there's the even unconscious awareness, or the conscious awareness that I'm resistant to it. So there's that period of like, oh, I actually didn't even know that was the thing.
Yeah.
First.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So so it's been a big learning curve actually, and you know, I've never really. I'm sure she'd be quick to tell you that she's had to mentor me for the last 6 or 7 years, but I'd never looked at it like that till now.
Yeah, interesting. And kind of moving away from that. That kind of transformation and mentorship around the 12-step program, what other areas of life do you have mentors in now? Obviously, the relationship with your wife. What other areas do you have mentors in?
Well, the work that I do today. So, like from a business perspective, you know, I said business. You know, my business is me, but working for myself and kind of moving into the working within the corporate environment and everything that kind of comes with that. I have a mentor now who I simply I wouldn't be anywhere near where I am today if it wasn't for him.
And that's Hass, right?
That's Hass, yeah. Who, as well as being my mentor now, has, you know, arguably become one of my closest friends.
Yeah.
Well, yeah.
I don't know. I've never met him. I don't know what type of guy he is. I wonder if kind of listening to how we're going to talk about him over the next few minutes is going to make him a little embarrassed, perhaps. I don't know. So, like, how did you meet Hass? Was that like a very conscious and deliberate, will you be my mentor kind of thing?
No, no, not at all. I mean, listen, firstly, I didn't know that I didn't even know that there was, you know, I didn't know about mentorship. I'd worked in a factory. I'll tell you the full story, right? I'll tell you as quickly as I can because it's quite an incredible one. So I'd been volunteering with a charity called the National Association of Children of Alcoholics that I'd been volunteering with for a long time. And I'd been sort of putting myself out there. I didn't have social media until I started making some content for like to help children affected by parents drinking. And I did a few things on TV and stuff for them. And I was getting depressed in the job that I was working as a transport manager, and I was, you know, getting really depressed in it. It wasn't fulfilling me or anything like that. I thought there was more for me, and I couldn't. You know, I was on quite a good salary, but was completely untrained, and I didn't want to just go and be a transport manager somewhere else, right? Because I knew it would be as unfulfilling. So I had I was married to my wife by that time, and I think both of my kids. She was certainly pregnant with our second child, and so I felt very stuck in this job. Anyway, I applied for a job in a prison as a prison officer because I thought I'll be working with vulnerable people. It'll be good, I can learn about working with vulnerable people, and maybe some other positions will come up, right? And I'll grow as an individual in that. So I applied. I got the job. It was going to be enough money to kind of support my family, which was important. I did this training. They fast tracked me and said, "Yep, we want you in there. We just got to wait for your criminal record check." Now, my criminal record doesn't make for good reading from my teenage years. And they said, "What's on your criminal record?" And I said, honestly, I don't know. Like, I mean, and they said, "Have you ever been to prison?" I said, "No." I said, "I've been to court a few times, I got, done for some pretty dodgy, like mainly violent sort of drinking stuff when I was younger." Anyway, just as I was about to leave my job to get that job in the prison, the criminal record checks come back and they refused me. They said it's too, there's too many things on them. What had happened is when I was like 21, I had a conditional discharge that lasted for a suspended sentence that lasted for 5 years, which meant that it wasn't spent, basically. They get spent after like 5 years. But because of that 5-year period, it was only like another year or two since that period had actually ended, despite how long I'd been on the road. Anyway, that was January of whatever year it was. I started putting content out, and I said to my wife, "I'm going to leave my job this year and I'm going to work for myself," right? And she said, "All right, what are you going to do?" And I said, "I don't know. That will become clear this year." I wrote down 3 things: work for myself, fully in my purpose, running my own business. And I stuck them all around the house. My wife used to text me when I was at work, and I said, "I'm going to leave my job." I did something for ITV News about children of alcoholics in February. And I was just getting into bed, and I got a message on Facebook from a woman in Australia. And it said, "I think you're my cousin." She had a different surname to me. She said, "I'm contacting you because my brother's asked me to reach out. He lives in England, and his name is," he won't mind me saying, "Mark Connolly," same surname as me. So I was like, "All right, well, I'll speak to him tomorrow." Spoke to him the next day. Turns out he's my cousin. His dad was my dad's brother. We had no idea each other existed. So I went and met him. He lived about 2 hours from me. We met somewhere in between. Chatted for a bit. He's like, "What do you do for a living? Do you do what you do? I saw you on the news. Do you do that for a living?" And I was like, No, but I'm going to leave my job. This is what I'm going to do. Da, da, da. Anyway, he said, "Look, I'll introduce you to this guy that I worked with who was my coach. His name's Hass. Let me try and hook you up with him, see if he'll give you some time. He's a good friend of mine." So Hass had said, "I'll give him a couple of hours to see if there's anything that we can do." I went and met Hass in London. Had no idea, told him a bit about my story and my values and what I wanted to do in life. And we spent about 4 hours together, and he just said, "I'm going to help you." And I said, "Listen, I don't have any money, right? I mean, I was living paycheck to paycheck." And he said, "I don't care, I'm going to help you." And within 2 months, I had a website. And I think within a month of that, I had my first major client delivering resilience training. So, I mean, did some coaching training in the June, website in the August, first major client in September, I think. So, yeah, and the rest is history, so to speak. And then our relationship has blossomed like tenfold,
That is a good story. That is a really, really good story. And what I love about this is that, right, on the hero's journey, there's a point right at the start which is called refusal for the call. Right? There's a call to adventure. Then there's a refusal of the call, which so many people get stuck in because they feel like they want to do something, and then they see the complexity of it, or they feel the fear of it, and they lean out. And it happens in those small moments. It happens like when you get a message from someone in Australia saying, "Will you go and meet your potential cousin to have a chat?" Like, so many people would opt out at that point because that is the fear of the unknown, because that is what the unknown is. But you leaned in, and that would be the kind of mechanism that would start this all off. And it's really, really, it was really a good story.
Yeah, it's crazy. Yeah, it's crazy how we met. Yeah.
And obviously, you've become good friends now. So he's more than just a mentor, but why has he ultimately become so important to you?
Because I had no idea what I was doing, right? No idea. I mean, I'd never been to a workshop, let alone delivered one. I had no idea what I was doing. I didn't know. Uh, this is how this is how little I knew about what I was doing. I remember Hass introduced me to another guy called Ollie, who's also become a good friend of mine. And he said Ollie is a guy. He's a little bit younger than you, but he's got his own business. Quite, it's like a quite big business. He does this. He's just started a podcast. He'd be interested to meet you. And when I was going to meet him, it was like one of the first people other than Hass that I had met. Hass told me that he was a young man who had his own business. The only thing I assumed he would, The Apprentice on telly.
Yeah.
I thought he was just going to be like one of them guys. I thought he would turn up in a suit. He'd have a briefcase because he's got a business, right? And he was going to sit down, and that's what he was going to be like. And when a young lad turned up who was, essentially just looked a bit like me, I was genuinely baffled. I didn't know. I thought the corporate environment was people that wore suits and went to work with briefcases. I mean, I genuinely did. I knew nothing. I knew nothing about anything. So for every single thing I'd done for the first year or two, I had to ask Hass. People would email me, and I wouldn't even know what they were asking me, and I would have to forward it to Hass and say, I don't know what this means. Can you help me? Stupid little questions about anything and everything, right? I lent on him so much, and he just gave me all the time in the world. And he used to say, "You'll repay me. You'll repay me." And I remember going back to my wife and like at the beginning, might saying to my wife, "This guy's going to help me," and even she was like, "Well, what's he want for it?" And I was like,
Yeah.
he keeps saying nothing, right? And he's continued to say nothing. And I think there was one time when things had started to kind of take off for me, and I was starting to get some, good amount of work, and I was not necessarily, living from paycheck to paycheck or anything like that. And I said to him, like, I need to have a conversation with you about money now, and like how I'm going to start paying you. And he actually probably got a little bit annoyed about it, because we'd developed this friendship, and it was almost like a friend asking a friend if I needed to pay him to lend an ear. And he said, "Don't." He really clearly said to me, "Don't ever bring it up again." Right? I get why you've asked me, but don't ever bring it up again. And it seems crazy to me that I would even ask him if I had to pay him in the friendship that we've got now. But yeah, this is just an individual who gave me times, and I promise you, we are like, as somebody, I live a busy life now in terms of the work that I do. When I look back at how often I was texting him, and I would be like, of course, I didn't know that you could go back to an email 3 hours later. I'd get an email through, and I'd be like, Hass, I need to send this email back. Like, and he'd probably be on calls, and he would get on the call to me, and he'd go, just send that. You're fine. Just send it. So it's all of that stuff. I absolutely needed it. In no way am I self-made.
Yeah. Well, that is truly incredible, and I think once people find your stuff, they're probably going to be sending Hass a load of emails to say, "Will you be my mentor?" No. So, what was my next question going to be? It was really important, obviously. And like your relationship with Hass has evolved now, and it's interesting that you kind of say it's almost like that same year of codependency that you had in that first year of. Right. But I find that so interesting, and maybe like you said, codependency in normal behavior is not necessarily a good thing to go down. But when you're embracing an adventure that is so alien, that is so wildly unknown, having that mentor in place in terms of a support structure and a guide is so crucial. And obviously, like, he had the skills with which for you to kind of say, like, what would I do in this circumstance? But from a values perspective, from a character perspective, what values did Hass portray that you were like, oh my God, it's so amazing to have this guy in my corner?
I tell you what, I got through the first year on his belief. It was his belief in me that got me through the first year. I mean, from the moment we sat down at that first meeting and I said to him, I told him what I earned a year, because we talked for like 3 hours, and he was like, what do you need to earn to survive? And I told him what I earned a year, and I remember telling him and thinking, this is where he's going to go. And he went, and I thought, oh, there you go. He's going to say it's going to be too hard. And he went, you'll make that easy. First year, we could do that. And like his utter belief, sheer belief in what I was about and what I could offer was the only thing that enabled me to, you know, not the only thing, my wife's support and my wife's family support, because my wife's family said to me, you know, you leave your job, we've got too much around us for you to fall back on. If it goes tits up, you know, you'll go back to another job. We'll find a way. But it was Hass's belief that that made me take that leap. And then I would say to him, you know, company would say they'd want me to come in, and I'd go to him and be like, well, I ain't gonna be able to do this, am I? They want me to come in and do a workshop. What, with a company like that? I've got no chance. And he would see it in me. I don't know. He would be able to. He knew when to say. He had a skill, and it's a coach's skill, really. I know that now. When to say, you know the answer to that. Don't come and go and do it. You can do it. And when he knew when to say, actually, Josh probably doesn't know this. Let me tell him. And do, you know, kind of do that stuff. He would write emails for me, but he would never write it from scratch. I would send him an email and say, what do you think of this? And then he would send me the email back rewritten. And then on our next conversation, he would say, tell me what I changed about the email and why I changed it. And then I would learn. And then he had the absolute knack of, when I produced something, I would send it to him and say, what do you think of this? And he wouldn't just go, it was crap, but he'd let me know it was no good. And if it needed completely scrapping and starting again, he had a way of telling me that kind of vitalized me, that I would go away and I'd be like, I can't wait to get this right and give it back to him. So yeah, I guess it was that kind of skill to see in me what I perhaps couldn't see in myself.
Yeah. And you're, from our kind of prep conversation, you're doing mentoring now yourself, particularly as far as it goes to the 12-step program, right? Because that's the cyclical nature of the 12-step program, is you get to mentor people. And you said earlier about how, like Hass said, you will repay me in time, I think he said. So based on your kind of experience of mentoring others now, how do you think he's being repaid?
I absolutely know. I mean, I always assumed it was going to be when I became a big, massive, rich businessman and started sending business his way. Right? That's what I thought. I tell you what it is. When you're helping somebody out and you see them achieve, it's difficult to replicate that. I would go as far as to say that's more enjoyable than when you get a big achievement yourself. I think I would go with that, yeah.
Yeah. And step 12 of the program, I believe, is service.
Yeah, I mean, look, when it comes to the 12 steps, it's part of, arguably making sure that I help other people is part of what keeps me sober. I mean, that's part of the game. Yeah, that's part of what you should do. So in a 12-step context, it's literally, if I stop doing it, I'm not taking seriously what I should, what I'm grateful for. So from a 12-step perspective, I mean, on a sobriety journey, it's absolutely vital in terms of like mentoring and helping supporting people in more of a kind of business person mentorship. It's more of what I've just said, yeah. But then again, listen, some of the people that I've mentored into sobriety, and you see their life come back together. I mean, again, that's probably better than my sobriety itself.
That's really interesting. But of course, you had to do it first be able to pass on that knowledge, and that's
Exactly.
ultimately the cycle of mentorship works that way. And part of me was about to say, you know, not everybody in life is going to be able to find someone like a Haas, and then I caught myself, because that is a limiting belief, right?
Yeah.
I'm absolutely certain anybody could find their own version of a Haas if they wanted to, and the limiting belief of saying, oh well, not everybody can do it, will stop you reaching out.
Yeah. Yeah.
But there are other ways of receiving mentorship, and we mentioned Dr. Gabor Mate earlier, who you see as a mentor that you've never met. So how does that kind of idea work in your mind?
I have met him once, but only to.
Oh, have you? Awesome.
I have, yeah, I have. But he was my mentor way before I met him. And I went to a 7-hour workshop with him, with about 80 other people. And when I say met him, afterwards, I sat next to him while somebody took a picture of us. And I said, "Hello, Gabor, you changed my life." And that was it. I can tell you that without question, Gabor Mate has no idea who I am. Still, despite that meeting, despite me dreaming up the fact that I was going to leave a massive, memorable mark on him and he was going to reach out to me, it didn't happen. In the world that we live in today, and the way in which content can be produced, and people's kind of visions and thought leaders, and the way in which they're able to put their message out into the world, I believe you're able to tap into people in a way that can help them to mentor you, and certainly from a kind of a journey of self-compassion, a journey of compassion for others. It's been Gabor Mate's key core message that I turn to in terms of the work that I do. Everything that I do is laced really with a lot of his work and his narrative, and that's come from, you know, watching seminar after seminar of him. I've read all, you know, most of his books, heard him on podcasts, to the point of if he was on a podcast, you could pause it every time a podcaster asked him a question, and I could answer it how he would answer it. I reckon I could give the answer that Gabor would give. Yeah.
And what I find interesting about that is, because you said about, like, when you listen to someone so much, then you get, because I've been to a whole host of Tony Robbins things, and I wouldn't be able to be quite as intricate as that, but I would be able to say, oh well, that's going to lead into this story, and I've heard that story, and this is the approximate thing that he's going to say. So there's the content piece, right? But I love the fact that you said it's his compassion that resonates with you, because that goes beyond content into actually looking at the values that the character that he portrays. And I would venture that, yes, a lot of his content might flow through you, but also the way that he interacts with the world and the way that he relates with the world also inspires you to follow in a similar manner.
Without question. I mean, I could, you know, I could literally add nothing to what you've just said there. I think it's just genuinely. I mean, like what you've articulated is down to a T correct. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, last question then. If you were to undertake a whole new terrifying journey that you knew nothing about in any way, shape, or form, how would you go about finding a mentor?
I would be very open to the world about who I am and what I'm trying to achieve. My experience in the last 4 years has, and by the way, I would couple the openness, having the vulnerability to be open about who I am and what I'm trying to achieve, and give away any value that I can to people where I think I can, right? My experience has been that over the last sort of 4 years of going alone and in the way that I have, my experience has been that when I've put myself out there and showed people that, you know, I'm on this journey and this is where I am, the help and support has showed up because I've communicated to the world who I am and what I need. And as much as there are bad people in the world, I think there's a lot of good people in the world, and I think we tend to connect with one another. And I think if you're a good person and your intentions are right, when you put that out in the world, you know, what's the old proverb? When the student is ready, the teacher appears, something like that.
That's exactly what I was thinking in my head.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I think as kind of cheesy as that may sound, I genuinely believe that's the reality, and that you know that has been and continues to be my experience. I've recently just connected with a couple of people actually who have showed up in my life. A couple of men who showed up in my life at the right time, who you know I have definitely struck up connection with that are going to help me. I don't know how, but in some way they're going to be there and be good men for me. So I think that's from having that vulnerability to make connections and allow myself to share. You know, don't try and show up as anything other than what I am. Does that make sense?
It makes a ton of sense. And what I love is the fact that, like, with that openness, you're talking about these kind of like these men that have entered your life now. Like, you don't know what that's going to turn into. You don't know what that's going to lead to. You're not kind of like, you've not got a rigid, structured idea of where that's going to go. You're just open to the concept, because I think so many times when we think about like interaction and connection, we think about value exchange.
Yeah.
One person giving this, another person giving this for a mutually valuable relationship, which for me constricts the idea for something to develop naturally, because you're forcing it down a route based on a prescribed narrative rather than just letting it develop.
Yeah.
So I love the fact that you're kind of doing that. But Josh, this has been genuinely brilliant. I really
enjoyed
hope that, I really hope that some people get an idea of what they can do and the importance of mentorship, both from a delivery standpoint and a recipient standpoint. You know, I think we all want a Mr. Miyagi in our lives, but we're afraid to need that. There's a point where we get to a certain age or something like that, we think, I'm too old to have a mentor or a father figure or a guide. I shouldn't need one. So I really appreciate you sharing your story and your lessons learned and your vulnerability today.
Thank you. I appreciate it. It's been look, thank you for creating the space. It's been an enjoyable hour.